Chris Wren. I'm the chair of the XCS Advisory Committee, and I'm filling some big shoes right now because Jared Johnson, who's also part of the Advisory Committee, generously peer-reviewed our next presentation but couldn't make it this morning, so I get the honor of introducing these fine gentlemen. We're very lucky to have the opportunity today to hear about engineering code development. Art and content have been taking the spotlight for years, as many of you know, but there's been a steady growth in engineering code development as well. And just as art and content look for solutions for scalability, specialization, localization, and cost control, engineering can also leverage the global market to find solutions for ever-increasing development demands. Today we'll be hearing from two industry experts who have been evolving engineering co-development relationship for years. So please give a warm XDS welcome to Group Technical Director, Electronic Arts, Andrew Pojar, hailing from Vancouver, and Vice President of Technology, Globant's Diego Tartara, hailing from Buenos Aires.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. So my name's Andrew Pojar. I'm a Group Technical Director here at EA here in Vancouver. I've been working with external developers on projects for the past 7 or 8 years, and most recently we've been working with Globant, and specifically for me on the NHL and UFC projects. As you can see from my picture here, I'm a solid team player. If you're ever looking for a novel team-punishing, team-building event, check out Tough Mudder. In fact, for a good laugh, you can Google Tough Mudder electroshock therapy to see pictures of people getting shocked by 10,000 volts in a giant pit of mud. It's good times.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diego Tartara. I'm VP of Technology for Globant, for which I've been working for the last 8 years, always closely related to the EA account. I started working as a software engineer for Origin. Then I led the local team down there in Buenos Aires for Origin. I've been involved with 2 FIFA cycles as a technical director, overseeing the whole development process. And then I took a role leading the gaming studio for the company, and EA being our largest client. So, I mean, clearly I didn't pick the right picture, but the problem is that Posh came to me and said, you know what, I'm gonna use sports-related team building type of picture, and he came out with this, and how can you beat that? I mean, so I'm all into sports, but the thing is I do swimming, so all I could find was pictures on my Speedo, so that wouldn't cut it, so I had to go with that one.
So there's a number of reasons why you might be interested in co-development. For you, it could be access to local knowledge in international markets, leveraging time zones for 24/7 support of live services, or access to specialized talent. Cost is always going to be a big driver, and it was for us, but this also allows us the flexibility to keep our core teams relatively stable, and then use an external team to scale as needed through the business cycle. For NHL in particular, obviously we wanted to harness the great passion that the Argentinian people have for the sport of ice hockey.
Oh, no. Good. So I think Posh covered most of the key aspects, but I think that there's one additional scenario that for us is very common, and it's when your client does not have the required expertise. And this applies very well to aiming as well, because sometimes there are some satellite type of work that it's not probably core to game development. However, it's very core and important for your business. And that's why we've been doing jobs such as payment gateways, big data, customer support system for EA as well. So how did we get here? This is our journey. It all started in 2007. Actually, we started in 2008 with sports. So back then, EA had the mandate to leverage more and more external outsourcing partners. So they called us. First game was Godfather 2, closely followed by FIFA 09. I think that back in the day, the exercise EA was doing was that they were doing regular capacity calculations. So they came up with a team to tackle the job that they needed to do. And they said, we will cover this many positions ourselves with the internal resources, and we'll use Globant or other partners to cover for the rest. But they didn't take into account time differences, distributed development, and we didn't do great, actually. It was like, those were very tough cycles. We were struggling, to be able to release. At every stage, we were facing different problems. We learned from our mistakes. However, subsequent cycles were now better. I mean, we improved on some aspects, but it wasn't great. So we put a lot of stretch in the engineers, in the team itself, to cover up for the lack of a framework, a proper framework. It wasn't uncommon to get to the office those days and find a couple of people from the team, especially during production and filing, sleeping on mats. So that eventually turned out into a lot of rotation, much more than what we were expecting.
So I think the turning point was kind of around 2013. It started a bit before that, but we kind of really started moving from a staff augmentation model to more of a mirrored dev team model. This started by including the first dedicated project managers, then moving to other roles such as embedded QA and producer roles, and most recently we kind of have embedded 2D artists so that we can have end-to-end feature production. Around that time in 2013, we also moved to working out of a single branch, and to me this is really where we started to move into a co-development model. It took us 5-6 years to get there. I don't think it needs to take that long, but through that process there was a lot of communication, and we started listening to each other and adapting along the way.
Starting at that point, we were able to take additional job by spinning off new small teams and organically growing from there, from the experience of senior engineers on the existing teams. Of course, this was in collaboration with EA. I mean, to be able to spin off, sometimes they weren't even for the same studio. So it was all about trust, and making sure we weren't creating heat on the other team. I think that the idea of this talk is to provide, we actually struggle a lot during the initial phases. So the first tip would be, do not expect everything to go out right the first time. It's very difficult. It's easy said, but it's very difficult to be there and see, your team failing and not making progress, having like a lot of blockers, and accept that as the first step into building a great relationship. But believe me, it is. And I think that the idea of this talk is to provide you with a few tips. We're not expecting for you to have the same type of experience that we faced. However, I'm sure you can actually leverage a few tips we will provide during this conversation, and those can be carried over into your own experience. And I think that could save you a lot of trouble, headaches, and eventually money.
So through the rest of the presentation, we're going to cover some of those key topics to think about, and also how they relate to this kind of engagement timeline down at the bottom here. We're going to largely focus on some of the earlier stages and setting that up for success, but many things apply right the way through. So to start, this can be a lot of work. So you need to be thinking about this as kind of a mid to long-term investment, and understand what that really means for your business. It might make a lot of sense. Maybe it doesn't make any sense for you. Both sides really need to come in with a single team mentality from the start. If you use that principle to guide your conversations and decision making, you're going to end up with the most effective partnership. And at the end of the day, it really just comes down to building trust.
So when to engage? This is a common topic, and I've been asked this many times from our clients. And in reality, I can't stress how important it is to start early on within the development phase. And that's important to be able to go through the team development phase early on. So when when you hit production and the most stressing part of your development cycles, your team is fully ramped up. A good advantage of long-term relationships is that you'll go through these stages much, much faster on subsequent engagements.
So yeah, the graphic we have here is Tuckman's stages of team development, forming, storming, norming, performing, and again, as Diego said, you want to take the time to go through those stages so that you can hit production, running. So from a client perspective, I think the anti-vision here is, you kind of get through the end of pre-production, you have that, oh crap, we don't have enough people to build this moment, and then start calling vendors. That scenario often ends with your external team just kind of hitting its stride as you're finally, getting the product out the door. To be fair, I think that this is how many people start their first engagement. But after you get smacked around a couple times, you learn not to do that. So as a client, before you even call a potential partner, there's a few things you need to think about. First, you can ask yourself, are you ready to handle this as a company? Are your processes mature enough? Will your team buy in? But beyond that, for engineering in particular, you need to start thinking about your code. So kind of the first step is to think about any intellectual property you might have. Something that is key to your business. If you have some amazing physics algorithm that you would want going out of house, those are the kind of things you want to identify. Sharing the entire code base is the easiest from a logistical standpoint, but it's not always a feasible option. So that's something that you're going to have to talk to with your business leaders and probably lawyers to kind of figure out. Beyond that, you're also going to want to figure out what kind of third-party, including open source software you have, and what the licensing agreements allow for. So from there, then that'll kind of build a picture for what you need to figure out in terms of your builds and workflows. If you've been listening to your technical people and you've been investing in clean modular architecture, this can be a relatively simple process. If you have a bunch of spaghetti code, this actually might be a limiting factor in whether or not you can have an external engineering engagement. So if you're going to be delivering a mix of both code and pre-built libraries, DLLs, things like that, you really need a robust pre-build system that is going to enable your partner to sync and match the code to those pre-built packages. We'll touch on this again a little bit later, but you really want simple, efficient workflows to maximize productivity. And a key here is having as much of this figured out before you engage is really going to help put you in the best place to succeed.
Infrastructure, a topic that is usually overlooked in this type of relationships. I can hardly stress how important it is for you, before approaching a vendor, had a clear detail of those requirements on beforehand. That will allow two things. One is for you to perform a vendor assessment, a correct vendor assessment, and for your vendor to eventually, before engaging, getting ready to do that. And that means investment. Things such as PC specifications, first-party hardware access, networking and security, access to development environments, access to tools and documentation, all of that combined with specific needs such as closed environments, isolated networks, bandwidth requirements, etc., they have to be clear, laid out before engaging with a vendor. This is where the vast majority of problems arises, but again, it's typically overlooked. And I have one example of this, how a little detail that we missed actually had a great impact during one of our development cycles. So at some point, Globant decided to do an investment and buy a dedicated DSL line to guarantee bandwidth, through output and upstream and downstream bandwidth dedicated for EA. So what we did, obviously we communicated this to EA, and what we did an assessment during 1 week to check, through output, daily usage, etc., to get the proper plan. And so we did. We did that for a week. We determined that daily consumption was around 100 megs. Peak through output was during night when we were doing full syncs, etc. And we decided to go with a certain plan. Everything went smoothly and perfect for a couple of months, till one day we got, during the day, we were doing nightly full sync ups, and we saw the process was still running, and there were like 40 hours left. So we were in panic, you're hitting finaling is the most critical part. You don't have time to spare, and there were still like 40 hours ahead. The problem was that when you get to that stage, a lot of graphical assets get updated, and they trigger the build of some pre-built packages, libraries and stuff, that are huge in size. I mean, orders of magnitude compared to source code. So we didn't take this into account at the time of the calculation. So to be able to actually solve that problem took us 2 days. 2 days where people were working on an all build, and also some other people were sent home and they had to come during the weekend. So a small little detail had a huge impact, and I think that there's many other examples where this can happen.
So now you're ready to build and organize your team. The first step is probably for the clients to be on site to conduct interviews. Focus on the key leadership roles to start, the project manager, SE leads, producer if you're going to go that route. But a key learning when you start to fill out the whole team is don't ask for senior people and then give them junior work. They're just going to get bored, they're going to leave, and you're going to be back interviewing again. We've learned this the hard way a few times where we ask for a Picasso, we give them a paint by numbers assignment, and we end up with a crappy painting or no painting at all. As a client, really what you want to think about is building a team like you would internally. Things like career progression, fit, culture matter just as much as C++ skills. Beyond that, a good blend of junior and senior people on those teams will allow that room for the career progression and will reduce turnover in the long run. Again, this is a longer-term investment. As you progress further in your relationship, the partner team can really help drive the interview process. You can help facilitate this by inviting the leads and project managers into the interviews, into the initial interviews with you to begin with. This helps build alignment on the types of things that you're looking for. We're at a point now with Globant where it's pretty rare for us to veto somebody that they've suggested. This saves us a lot of time, and this is down to Globant's pre-screening process. This partnership is especially important when candidates are nervous about interviewing with the client directly and often in their non-native language. There's been times where we came out of an interview and we were pretty iffy, but Globant really vouched for these people, and in the end they turned out to be top contributors. So again, that's a really valuable partnership.
So I want to add to that how we got there, and it all ends up in a word that you will see throughout this conversation a lot, and it's trust. And so at the very beginning, I was in charge of assembling those gaming teams. So I was doing pre-screening, syncing up with the EA team. So all I got was like a job description, if you wish. So it was, we need this skill set, this, and that. So I was conducting my own interviews and presenting the results to EA and suggesting some candidates. And I was like, it was very weird to me to find out that several candidates that I thought they were quite strong were being rejected. And some others that were just okay to me were being accepted. So at some point I sneaked out into one of their interviews, a couple of interviews, to tell you the truth. And it wasn't to cheat the system, it was actually to learn from them in the way they were conducting. And it was very productive. So I found two different things. One is something that Posh mentioned, that the performance of people when doing an interview on their non-native language suffers a lot of impact sometimes. And the other one was that they were conducting interviews in a totally different way. So they were not only in the type of questions they were asking and exercises they were bringing, but also in terms of soft skills they were evaluating, that I wasn't just taking into account. Like, do you play games? What was the last game you played? Do you like sports, play sports, what? So what I did is I actually aligned my interviews into this methodology, and I started getting good results. So I came to EA and say, you know what, I've been thinking, and what I did is try to align to your expectations. So now I'm doing this, this, and that, and this is a pool of questions I'm using. So at that point, EA felt like, okay, good. I mean, this guy is actually working for us. I mean, he's not trying to push people through the door, but actually he's doing what we are supposed to do eventually. So they started to get the same results. I mean, their own screening process would end up having like much similar results than mine. So at some point, like Posh said, I mean, I was in charge of bringing people in, and I would only call out EA to do their own interview when I was iffy about a specific candidate. Another thing that we also put in place, and I think it's very important, and it's also part of the learning process, is to try to mirror the development team. So I think that communication becomes much more effective when it's being done over peers, you know, people with the same job. And this was pretty evident when we had our first producer on our side. So it was a conversation that took many cycles to fully materialize, but at some point EA decided to invest and put a producer on Globant side. So we hired this producer, and things were great. Actually, EA producer was talking and syncing up with this guy. This guy was, the first producer was called Ariel. Ariel is in total sync with our team. He's evangelizing the team constantly about, you know, features, how the game should play, feel, etc. He does side-by-side incremental reviews with the team members, so they have like a very quick turnaround. So in the end, when EA gets in touch for the first time with a certain feature, they have something with a tremendous difference in quality as in, compared to previous cycles. Another thing we do is how we anticipate capacity. You know, like you may need extra capacity because your client asks you to, or to mitigate risk. You know, people leaving the company and stuff like that. So we do that by using a method that's called shadows. And we call them shadows because there were people that were actually in the shadow. I mean, we didn't say, EA, we have a bunch of people learning, you know, from the team and trying to work with the team to learn the development process, the code base, etc., and to be able to be ready to jump in when we need them. But what happened is that when we were needing, you know, extra capacity, all of these people would suddenly come out to the light, and we have them here. So at some point, we also came straight with EA about this process. So they no longer work as shadows. So today they get a user, they get access to code base, they get to participate in daily Scrum, which is great for team building and for the morale of these people. However, of course, we don't commit extra capacity while they're training. And another important thing, and like I mentioned before, I mean, all of these require trust on both sides to be totally transparent and be able to materialize this. And another thing that I think it's important, worth mentioning, is that when certain people get to, especially senior people, happens to be a couple of cycles with a team, probably they don't feel challenged anymore. You know, I've done that before. I'm not seeing my career path. So we come, again, we do our own assessment on our people and are totally transparent with EA. So if some people is in risk of we're in risk of losing one person because of that, we come straight with EA, and they've always been very proactive towards trying to find you know, additional roles or other position to be able to properly give this guy continuity the same way they would do internally at EA. So I have an example of a great engineer that he was totally into engines and optimizations. He was totally thrilled about gaming, but the thing is he spent a couple of cycles and we got to this point. So EA at that point opened up the first position as systems engineer within Globant. And that guy did great and remained with the team for a couple of extra cycles. And it was actually a very nice win-win situation.
So development framework. Ensuring everyone understands the development framework is hugely important. This generally starts from the client's set of practices, and then both sides work together to figure out how best to integrate the two teams. Some advice here is that clients need to come in with an open mind. I think that this is especially true for clients new to distributed development, but oftentimes your external partner has more experience working in that manner than you do. So really be open to how to modify your practices. So part of the reason that this area is so important is that this is where trust can break down. And to me, this boils down to setting expectations for each stage of the project, how that relates to deliverables and how those deliverables are measured. Vocabulary and semantics really matter here. And this can be especially tricky when talking with language barriers. Things like, we saw it in the last presentation about baseball and cricket. Try to stay away from jargon and ensure that meaning is well understood. You're never going to get this right the first time, so plan to adapt and communicate as part of your development framework as well.
Again, I want to emphasize what Andrew just said. It's very important for a client to properly train a vendor about the development process, not only at the beginning, but throughout the whole cycle. Every client has its own way of doing things, but everyone thinks that it's just common sense. I mean, it makes sense. Can't you see it? It's clear. And it's not. It's not. It's very important to be in sync with that. And I think that one example I have for this is that I got to a point when I was doing daily reviews on a FIFA cycle, right? So I went side by side with each of the engineers, checking what they were doing, if they had any blockers, something I could help with, etc. So I had this top-notch engineer facing a bug. So I did the typical questions, can you repro the bug? Do you understand where it's coming, etc. He said, it's kind of difficult, but I think I got it. So that went on and on, for a couple of days. So I saw this guy who was totally stuck with one bug for a couple of days. So all the alarms trigger, and I said, let me see what you've been working with. So this guy would just start showing me, the source code. And what I see is that he had shelved 12 heavily modified files during finaling. And I was like, what have you done? He has been doing an re-architecture in finaling, final stages of a game development. He has been doing a re-architecture. This is, of course, adds a ton of risk you don't want to take at that stage. However, in a previous stage, that's actually the expected behavior. You aim for quality. If you find a way of doing it better, okay, do it. I mean, jump in and do it. So we actually failed to properly communicate this person, this engineer, what was expected from him at this specific stage.
On my first trip to Globant to meet the potential leads on NHL, one of the first questions they asked me is, will we be working out of the same branch? It was a great question, and it actually meant so much more than just the logistics. To kind of understand why I think we kind of need to take a step back and review some of those old projects.
On the original engagements that I was working for, we weren't working on mainline. We had a specific build for us. Even in one occasion, it was a Need for Speed cycle. we had a completely synthetic test bed that was only able to run screen flows. So people would never test with the actual game. And the problem that this carried on us was that when our build got broken, EA wouldn't notice because we were the only ones using that. So probably you got one morning into your job and found out that your build was broken and you weren't able to fix it because maybe the problem was in some areas of the code that you didn't have access. So at that point, the only thing left to do was to wait for half a day till EA gets to the office, gets to see it, and start working on a fix. And maybe that fix would be like another half a day, by which time, I mean, our team were heading home with the hope that the day after they will come, to the office and have a properly working build. So these small things may actually have a huge impact in your development cycle. And so, like Posh mentioned, I mean, I think it's very important to work on the same code base. So given that context, that original question ultimately came down to whether or not we were going to have a single team mentality or not. And again, when we made this decision to go to a single branch, that was our first step to true co-development. Now, as a technical director on a game team, broken builds are a top concern. So there's a few things you need to have in place. Things like automation, local QA, code reviews, things I could probably talk for another 10 minutes about, but I don't want Chris to freak out, so we're going to move on. So onboarding, I think we're going to skip this slide too, but for the sake of time. But I'm sure that all of you have amazing documentation that you totally keep up to date, as well as your training materials, so you'll be fine. So proactive communication. Communication is important through all stages of the development cycle. This is not going to be news to anybody here. That said, it's definitely easier said than done, and something that you're never done improving. So this is where your development framework and status reports, regular phone calls, video conferences come into play for sure. But it's really about how to create and facilitate an environment where organic SE to SE communication can happen. From a client side, one of my biggest worries on NHL was an individual or the whole team, sitting idle, waiting on us either to fix a build or solve a particular problem. Luckily, at the time, the tech lead at Globant, Martin Ferrari, who I just love his name, so that's why I had to mention him. Anyway, Martin, I love Martin. He was borderline militant when it came to pushing his team to reach out and ask questions, and he really tried to foster an environment a culture where there was no stupid questions. And I suffered this myself as an engineer, I remember when I started back in the day, I was very afraid of making stupid questions. Stupid because probably if I dig more into the code, I'll find out for myself, and stupid because I sound like Antonio Banderas in Puss in Boots. So, having communication in your non-native language is also a blocker for people. So the thing is that in reality, it's breaking that barrier, and I think you should leverage your development directors and technical directors to foster this type of communication. So as tips, for instance, if people is blocked with a problem, only allow them for a certain amount of time spent on finding out by themselves what the problem is, and otherwise pick up the phone. And also foster agile communication. Pick up the phone, use Skype, video conference, and try to avoid as much as possible mail. Use mail, for non-overlapping hours, but take advantage of, of a more agile type of communications if possible. So thinking as a single team has been a driver for everything we've covered so far, and there's a few things you can do to help foster this within your teams. Regular travel is hugely important both ways. Seeing people face-to-face, seeing how and where they work really will change how people communicate after that.
Also on those travels, take the time for team building functions. Doesn't always have to be Tough Mudder. Just going for a drink really helps. For some reason, it is just harder to let somebody down who you've been drunk with. Do not underestimate this. So, some key takeaways, or did you?
Sure, go ahead.
So those were kind of some of the key takeaways we had. Again, mid to long-term investment, single team mentality, engage early, workflows equals efficiency, proactively communicate, and set those clear expectations so you can develop the trust.
Thank you.